The descent pod hit atmosphere like a stone thrown into a pond, and Verena Halst had approximately 8 minutes to contemplate the administrative efficiency that had transformed her from a respected botanical cataloguer into planetary debris. The charges were technical, falsifying safety reports on xenoflora samples from the Kethros system. The reality was simpler. She'd corrected her supervisor's dangerously incorrect classifications, and he'd possessed both fragile pride and excellent political connections. Now she was being delivered to Kethros IV itself, a quarantine world whose primary exports were cautionary tales and death statistics. The pod's retro thrusters fired with all the grace of a controlled explosion, and Verena watched through the small viewport as an ocean of bioluminescent forest rushed up to meet her. The canopy looked almost beautiful in the fading daylight, pulsing with blues and greens that suggested either a thriving ecosystem or a very creative method of attracting prey. She suspected both. The pod crunched into a clearing with enough force to rattle her teeth, then hissed open with the cheerful optimism of machinery that didn't know it had just delivered someone to die. She emerged into air that smelled of rot and flowers in equal measure, thick with humidity and alive with sounds that defied comfortable categorization. The forest towered overhead, creating a cathedral-like space of massive trunks and interwoven branches that filtered the dying sunlight into scattered beams. Something howled in the distance, a sound that started low and climbed into registers that made her inner ear ache. Something else answered with a series of clicks that suggested either communication or echolocation, possibly both. Verena checked her chronometer, 14 minutes until full dark. She turned in a slow circle, assessing her immediate surroundings with the methodical precision that had made her excellent at her job and terrible at organizational politics. The clearing was roughly 40 meters across, dotted with scrub vegetation and what looked like scorch marks from previous pod landings. To the east, a rock formation jutted from the ground like broken teeth, defensible, heat-reflective, elevated enough to avoid ground-level surprises. She began walking toward it. The survival pack they'd provided was standard issue, which meant it was designed by someone who'd never actually needed to survive anything more challenging than a delayed shuttle. She inventoried the contents while walking: water purification tablets, 2 weeks of compressed nutrient rations that tasted like optimistic cardboard, basic medical supplies, a thermal blanket that weighed nothing and would accomplish approximately the same, and a multi-tool that at least suggested someone had put thought into something. No weapon, no communication device, no extraction plan. They'd been thorough. She reached the rock formation and immediately began gathering firewood. The trees here had bark that peeled in long strips, underneath which was wood with an unusual resinous quality that made it sticky to the touch. Potentially useful, resin meant longer burn time, more heat, possibly water resistance. She collected an armful of branches that had fallen recently enough to still have some moisture, but weren't so green they'd smoke excessively. The forest canopy above rippled with movement, and something watched her from the branches with eyes that reflected the last sunlight in amber flashes. Verena didn't look directly at it. Direct eye contact was confrontational in most species, and she had no interest in confrontation with something that could clearly see her better than she could see it. She arranged her firewood in a careful structure: tinder, kindling, fuel wood in ascending sizes, and used the multi-tools fire starter with hands that were steady through sheer force of will. The spark caught, the resinous wood caught beautifully, and suddenly she had light and heat pushing back against the gathering darkness. The forest responded immediately. The ambient chittering sounds dropped to silence, then resumed at a different pitch. The howling creature went quiet. New sounds emerged, rustling in the undergrowth, the snap of branches, something large moving with surprising stealth through the dense vegetation. Verena sat with her back to the rock formation, added wood to her fire, and began heating her first ration packet over the flames using a flat stone as an improvised pan. The ration smelled like salted nothing, but the act of cooking was itself a declaration. She was here, she was competent, and she would not be dying tonight. The bioluminescent moss on the surrounding trees pulsed in slow waves, and in that cold light she could see shapes moving at the clearing's edge, watching, waiting, evaluating whether she was predator, prey, or something novel enough to require observation. She ate her heated ration slowly, maintaining steady movements, and noted that fear was significantly less useful than curiosity. Fear made you run, and running here would be the last decision you'd ever make. By the time she'd finished eating, full darkness had arrived, and the forest had transformed into an alien light show of biological illumination and predatory patience. Verena wrapped herself in the thermal blanket, fed her fire, and began her first night on Kethros IV by cataloguing sounds and assigning them preliminary categories. Science had always been her comfort, and if she was going to die on this planet, she'd at least die understanding it. The first week taught her that patterns existed if you were patient enough to see them. Verena established a routine built on observation rather than desperate exploration. Each morning, she expanded her camp minimally, arranging stones to better reflect heat, constructing a windbreak from fallen branches, creating a small cache for her dwindling supplies. Each day she sat and watched, documenting everything she could see in precise notes, written on the back of her supply, manifest with a stylus she'd found in the survival pack. The creatures operated in shifts, she realized. Dawn brought scavengers, quadrupedal things roughly the size of large dogs, moving in pairs and communicating through elaborate clicking patterns. They investigated the clearing's edges, fought briefly over scraps they'd hidden the previous day, and retreated before the sun reached its zenith. Midday belonged to ambush predators, solitary hunters that blended so perfectly with the mottled tree bark that Verena only spotted them when they moved. They remained motionless for hours, waiting for smaller prey to pass within striking range, their patience absolute and terrifying. Night was pack hunter territory, creatures with too many legs and eyes that reflected firelight in coordinated sweeps of her perimeter, always moving, always testing, never quite approaching close enough for her to see them clearly. She learned that the bioluminescent moss wasn't decorative. It pulsed in predictable patterns, and those patterns changed approximately 30 seconds before predators moved through an area. The prey species had evolved to read these signals, and now Verena could too. The moss was her early warning system, nature's gift to anything smart enough to pay attention. Her cooking became ritualized. She prepared her rations at specific times, noting which smells drew curious visitors and which created zones of avoidance. The resinous wood produced sharp, clean smoke that irritated the dawn scavengers. They'd approach within 10 meters, then retreat with aggressive clicking sounds that suggested annoyance. The nocturnal pack hunters didn't seem bothered by the smoke at all, which implied different respiratory systems or perhaps different evolutionary pressures. She filed these observations away with the discipline of someone who'd spent years documenting alien plant life and knew that survival was just botany applied to different problems. Her campfire became the center of her world, a small declaration of human presence in an environment that had never encountered humans and didn't care to start. She fed it carefully, maintained it constantly, and treated it with the respect due to the only thing standing between her and hypothermia once the night temperatures dropped. The flames created a barrier that was more psychological than physical, but psychology mattered when you were alone on a planet that wanted you dead with the casual indifference of weather. On day 6, Verina's water situation became critical. She'd been rationing carefully, but the purification tablets only worked if you had water to purify, and her supply had dwindled to less than a day's worth. The stream she'd heard from her first night was roughly 200 meters east, identifiable by the sound and by the concentration of creature traffic flowing in that direction. Every species on this planet needed water, which meant the stream was a natural choke point where territorial disputes occurred and predators waited for thirsty prey to make fatal mistakes. She spent 2 full days observing the stream from a concealed position behind a fallen log, her chronometer in hand, creating a timeline of activity with the same precision she'd once applied to documenting flowering cycles. The dawn scavengers arrived first, drinking quickly and nervously, their heads constantly swiveling. The ambush predators positioned themselves in the branches overhead, occasionally dropping onto unwary visitors with lethal efficiency. The nocturnal pack hunters arrived in groups during twilight, aggressively displacing anything still lingering. But there was a gap. Between the hours of 1500 and 1700, the stream went quiet. Not empty, she could see smaller creatures still visiting, but the major predators withdrew. It took her another day of observation to understand why the gap represented a territorial transition period. The day hunters were retreating to their resting areas, the night hunters hadn't yet emerged, and neither group wanted to encounter the other during the changeover. It was a neutral zone in time rather than space, a 2-hour window when the forest held its breath. On day 8, Verina approached the stream during this window, moving at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than prey behavior. She'd learned from watching the successful drinkers, the ones who survived approached confidently, drank efficiently, and left without hesitation. Panic attracted attention. Confidence created ambiguity. She reached the stream bank, filled her containers through the purification filter, and retreated to her camp without incident. The forest watched her go with what felt like mild surprise that she'd figured out the schedule. She celebrated that evening by experimenting with local food sources. Her botanical training provided a framework. Toxicity testing required patience and systematic exposure. She'd identified a tuber growing near the stream, something that grew in clusters and had a fibrous exterior. She tested it first against her skin, no reaction, then against her lips, no burning or numbness, then a tiny amount on her tongue, waiting 4 hours between each step, ready to purge her system at the first sign of trouble. The tuber, when finally roasted over her campfire on day 10, tasted like bland potato crossed with wood pulp. It was the most delicious thing she'd eaten since arriving. She catalogued its growing location, its appearance, and its preparation requirements with the joy of someone who'd just extended her survival timeline indefinitely. Over the following days, she found berry clusters that were toxic when raw but safe when boiled, discovered a bark that made surprisingly acceptable tea, and learned that one species of tree-dwelling creature was slow enough to catch, and when properly prepared, provided protein and fat her body desperately needed. Her safe zone expanded incrementally, measured in careful observations and small tests. She wasn't conquering the forest. The idea was absurd. She was learning to exist within its rhythms, finding the spaces where human presence didn't immediately trigger a predatory response. It was the difference between fighting a current and learning to swim with it, and Verina had always been better at adaptation than confrontation. On day 17, something changed. Verina was preparing her evening meal, roasted tuber and preserved tree creature, arranged on a flat stone near her fire, when every ambient sound in the forest ceased simultaneously. The clicking dawn scavengers went silent mid-conversation. The smaller creatures that rustled through the underbrush froze. Even the bioluminescent moss seemed to pulse more slowly, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then it emerged from the tree line. The creature was massive, easily 6 meters from its armored head to its segmented tail, built like something evolution had designed specifically to end arguments. Its body combined reptilian fluidity with crustacean armor plating, each segment overlapping in a way that suggested both protection and flexibility. Multiple sensory appendages extended from its head, twitching independently as they sampled the air. Its legs, she counted 6, moved with surprising coordination, placing each step with deliberate care. The ambient firelight caught its eyes, revealing intelligence that was distinctly unsettling. Verena continued cooking. Her hands wanted to shake, her instincts screamed to run, but she'd been watching this species from a distance for over a week. She knew how it hunted: motion detection and panic response. It could achieve startling bursts of speed, despite its bulk, running down prey that fled with the efficiency of a guided missile. Running would be both futile and provocative, essentially asking to be killed. She turned her skewered tuber over the flames with steady, deliberate movements and began speaking. "The problem with botanical taxonomy," she said, her voice conversational despite her racing heart, "is that it's built on arbitrary distinctions made by people who were more interested in being remembered than being accurate. Take the classification of terrestrial ferns, 17 different families based on reproductive structures that exist on a spectrum rather than in discrete categories." The creature circled her camp, its massive head swiveling to track her movements. Its sensory appendages extended toward her fire, sampling the smoke. She could smell it now, something between sulfur and copper, with an underlying musk that suggested it hadn't bathed recently. Not that she was in any position to judge. "And don't even get me started on the politics of naming conventions," Verena continued, maintaining her steady tone. Sound was important. It provided continuous feedback that she was calm, non-threatening, possibly insane but not aggressive. Half of species classification is just academic feuding encoded into Latin. Brilliant. The creature completed its second circle, and then instead of attacking or leaving, settled at the edge of her firelight. It lowered its bulk carefully, armor plates clicking against each other, and appeared to simply rest. Verena could see it more clearly now. The armor was covered in parasites clustering around the joints, and its breathing seemed labored. This wasn't a creature at the peak of its power. This was something exhausted. On impulse, she tossed a piece of her roasted tuber toward it, not close enough to seem aggressive, but near enough to be an offering. The creature examined the food with one sensory appendage, which extended and retracted like a question being asked. Then it consumed the tuber in a single motion and fixed her with what might have been curiosity. They sat together for nearly an hour, woman and monster, separated by firelight and evolutionary history, connected by mutual exhaustion and the strange comfort of not being alone. Eventually, the creature rose and retreated into the forest with surprising quietness for something so large. Verena watched it go and realized she was crying, though she couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the loneliness of being the only human on a planet. Perhaps it was the recognition that even apex predators could be tired. Perhaps it was just relief at not being eaten. She added wood to her fire and allowed herself the luxury of feeling something other than clinical detachment. The forest had acknowledged her, not as prey or threat, but as another living thing occupying space. It was more than she'd gotten from Meridian's arch in years. The weeks blurred into months, and Verina's camp transformed from desperate survival position into something resembling a home. She'd constructed a smoke rack using green wood that wouldn't burn, suspended over her fire at the precise height to preserve meat without cooking it. She'd established multiple water collection points corresponding to different safe windows throughout the day. The stream during the afternoon gap, a small spring she'd discovered during the morning scavenger period, and rainfall collection using her thermal blanket stretched between supports. Her map of the surrounding area had grown detailed, marking creature territories, plant distributions, and the invisible boundaries that separated safe zones from death zones. She'd stopped thinking about rescue, not consciously, not as a decision, but the mental shift from temporary survival to indefinite residence had occurred so gradually she barely noticed. It changed everything. Temporary survival meant rationing, conserving, waiting. Residence meant cultivation, expansion, routine. She slept in 2 4-hour blocks during the predator transition periods when the forest went quiet. She'd learned to identify approaching weather by watching the dawn scavengers. They retreated to high ground 12 hours before rainfall, providing more reliable forecasting than any satellite. Her garden had taken root near her camp, a small plot where she'd transplanted tubers and berry plants to eliminate risky foraging trips. She'd learned to render fat from the tree-dwelling creatures, which added actual flavor to the bland tubers and made the preserved meat less aggressively terrible. Her cooking had evolved from survival necessity to something approaching craft, not because she enjoyed it particularly, but because the ritual provided structure to days that otherwise blurred together. She named the regular visitors with the casual efficiency of catalog maintenance. The massive creature that had first entered her camp became Catalog 7 and returned periodically, always settling at the edge of her firelight, never threatening. Several dawn scavengers who consistently traveled together became the twins, though there were actually 3 of them. A peculiar flying creature that hovered near her fire, apparently attracted to the warmth, became Census because it seemed to be documenting her as thoroughly as she documented it. The forest had transformed from hostile environment to familiar territory. Not safe, it would never be safe, but comprehensible. She understood its rhythms the way she'd once understood the flowering cycles of Andromedan moss flowers, and that understanding created a space where survival felt less like luck and more like skill. She'd built something here that made sense according to rules that were clear and honestly enforced by nature, rather than arbitrarily imposed by committee. 3 months into her exile, Verina sat by her campfire preparing an evening meal with the practiced efficiency of routine. The roasted tubers had been seasoned with rendered fat, and a mineral-rich bark she'd discovered added an almost salty complexity. The preserved tree creature meat had cured properly using techniques she'd refined through careful experimentation. The tea steeping in her improvised cup, a hollowed segment of heat-resistant wood, released the pleasant nutty aroma of local leaves that provided a mild stimulant effect without the jitters of actual caffeine. The forest pulsed with its usual bioluminescent rhythm, each pattern now as familiar as breathing. The moss near the eastern perimeter flashed in the specific sequence that meant the nocturnal hunters were beginning their rounds approximately 800 meters out, right on schedule. She was expecting Catalog 7, whose visits had become semi-regular over the past month, always during this same hour, always maintaining the same respectful distance at the edge of her firelight. The tea was almost ready when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the forest symphony. Mechanical, distant but approaching, engine noise cutting through the biological soundscape like a blade through silk. Verina looked up and saw lights in the sky. Not the steady pinpoints of stars or the occasional meteor streaking past, but deliberate navigation lights arranged in a pattern she recognized from thousands of orbital approaches. A shuttle, descending, toward her position. She took another sip of her tea and watched the shuttle's approach with the mild curiosity of someone observing an unexpected variable in a controlled experiment. Someone had decided her exile had lasted long enough. Perhaps they needed her expertise for another botanical classification disaster. Perhaps this was bureaucratic theater, exile and redemption, demonstrating both punishment and mercy for the administrative record. Perhaps her supervisor had been transferred or died or simply forgotten why he'd been angry. The shuttle descended through the canopy, its engines creating a wash of displaced air that disturbed her carefully arranged camp. Smoke from her fire bent sideways. Her garden plot rippled under the pressure wave. The shuttle landed in the clearing with the graceless practicality of government equipment, its ramp extending with a hydraulic hiss that made the dawn scavengers scatter and sent Catalog 7, who'd just emerged from the tree line, retreating back into the forest. Verena added another piece of wood to her fire and considered the situation. The shuttle sat there, running lights illuminating the clearing, ramp extended in obvious invitation. Someone inside was undoubtedly waiting for her to rush forward in grateful tears, relieved to be rescued from the death world that had been her prison. She took another sip of her tea and thought about her tubers, which would need harvesting in another week. She thought about the water collection schedule she'd perfected, about the smoke rack that had taken her 2 weeks to design properly, about the map she'd been expanding that now covered roughly a square kilometer of thoroughly documented territory. She thought about Catalog 7 and the twins and census, about the patterns she'd learned and the rhythms she'd synchronized with. The forest had never lied to her. It had never pretended to be safe when it was dangerous. It had never punished her for being precise or exiled her for being right. It simply existed according to its nature, and her survival had depended on understanding that nature honestly. The shuttle's external speaker crackled to life, someone preparing to make an announcement, but Verena wasn't listening. She was watching the bioluminescent moss at the clearing's edge, which had begun pulsing in a new pattern, something she hadn't seen before. The forest was responding to the shuttle's presence, recalibrating its rhythms around this foreign intrusion. She noted the pattern carefully, documenting it with the same attention she'd given everything else, and wondered what it meant. She supposed she should at least hear what they had to say. But there was no urgency in the thought, no desperate relief. The fire needed tending, after all, and the tea was almost the perfect temperature, and Catalog 7 would probably return once the shuttle noise stopped disturbing the evening's established routine. Verena took another sip of her tea and allowed herself a small smile. 3 months ago she'd been dumped on a death world with nothing but a survival pack and the administrative certainty that she'd be dead within a week. Now she was sitting by her fire, drinking acceptable tea, with calloused hands and a garden that needed weeding, and a detailed understanding of an alien ecosystem that no human had ever bothered to actually observe. The forest pulsed with light around her, patient and honest, and for the first time in her professional life, Verena Holst felt absolutely no desire to correct anyone's classifications.